you so much. That was terrific. We're very fortunate this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are, to have such a wonderful group of speakers and such interesting and very somewhat different perspectives. So what would be useful now is, and I put it in the chat, go to the reactions button at the bottom right of your screen, and there's a raise your hand little hand there. And if you would like to raise a question, make a comment, please do so at this point. I also have some questions and comments that I have, I will also introduce some of those. But before I do, let's just see if anybody has a question that is so burning that they want to start out the discussion. Well, let me start. And was I correct in believing that Linda Grattan will be on the discussion?
Yes, I think she'll try.
Okay, very good. All right, well, let me start with Albert, if I may. I think that one of the interesting points that you made, but really quickly, was that you think artificial intelligence is going to affect the work and well-being of the elderly. Could you say a little bit more about what in particular you think will change with AI?
Well, it's so new and it can be applied in so many ways. I think it's kind of hard to predict, but I've read some commentary, which I thought was very interesting, that suggested that AI might be very important for dealing with the feeling of social isolation of elderly people, like because AI can communicate with the elderly and provide direct interaction, give them stimulation in those ways. In the workspace, there's some recent work which suggests that AI is not as disequalizing as automation has been. You know, there's a pretty now well-worn story that automation has hollowed out the middle skilled workers and led to wage polarization, because it's those middle skilled workers who have the jobs that are most easily substitutable. And AI doesn't seem to have the same hollowing out effect. It seems to affect workers across the skill levels, or at least not in a systematic way. And again, it really depends. I don't think we know which sectors will be most impacted by AI, you know, and in which sequence. So maybe I'll stop there.
We'll come back to you next year for an update. Thank you. For a question for Wolfgang, people have suggested that having fewer people on Earth would be better for all kinds of sustainability reasons. And some have suggested a world population of at most 3 billion would be about what we could manage. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, that's a very difficult topic. It is indeed important to view the discussions that we now are having in terms of what are the effects of population aging on pension systems or the interactions with technology in the broader context of sustainable development at large. And here, one of the other big topics on the table clearly is climate change. We have done several studies of the interactions between population change and climate change, and it indeed goes both ways. It is the demographic trends that impact on the greenhouse gas emissions. And in this context, some evidence suggests that population aging actually has an effect in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because the elderly have less work-related travel or less working in the polluting factories. But it's a very subtle thing, and there are some other issues that also matter. Essentially, of course, the CO2 emissions are a direct consequence of expenditure on consumption. And so if the pensions are very generous, people will spend more on cruises or whatever is time consuming and CO2 emissions enhancing. The more important side actually is the adaptive capacity. There are many studies that showing that people, depending where they live, their age structure, their gender matters, how they are affected by climate change, and in particularly education is a very important vulnerability reducing effect. So we've done some considerations of what is an optimal fertility for a society or for the planet. If we not only look at the aging burden, but also look at the environmental burden. And that clearly brings the desired population size somewhat down. We're definitely not going to reach 3 billion by the end of this century, but we've done some simulations that if the whole world converges to, let's say, 1.5 children per woman, which is what we have in Europe on average at the moment, then already by 2200 or 2250, actually, we may be able to reach the 3 billion of then hopefully well-educated, healthy, and wealthy people who will be better empowered to cope with already unavoidable climate change. So I think it's just trying to broaden the picture. And again, human capital really has such an overriding importance there.
Could I have a follow-up? Olivia, could I have a follow-up on that? How do you deal with the transition? Isn't it going to be very tough if you just cut the birth rate and then you wait until all the people become 100 and die? There will be no workers left in the transition by the time you get into a new equilibrium of birth rates and death rates.
Well, if I can respond, I mean, this is already happening by itself. Like every country, first the European countries, then East Asia, followed by Southeast Asia, is already moving to sub-replacement fertility. Even India is now much more rapidly than it was anticipated below the replacement level. So the only world region is really Africa, where we still have rapid rates of population growth. And here we see in some countries like Kenya already just a little over 3 children. It used to be have 7 or 8. So there is a process of fertility decline, which again depends a lot on education of particularly women, but also reproductive health services and all these other factors. So of course, the different parts of the world will converge differently, but these models, really sort of very hypothetical simulations, assume that only by the end of this century, all the parts of the world will converge to 1.5. And actually, some parts in East Asia are already clearly below 1.5. And so we really don't know what's going to be the long-term level of reproduction on this planet. That's a really open question that we are hotly debating in the context of long-term population projections. We don't know, but I mean, everybody was surprised that a big country like Korea could really go significantly below the 1.0 one child per woman on average that nobody thought possible in the past.
Let me ask a question of Yao Hui. So one thing that we've only touched on slightly is the changing role of women in an aging society. Do you have any thoughts you would share with us about that question?
Is this to me? Or?
Yao Hui.
Hui.
You're on mute. I can't hear you.
So the one issue, one gender issue is health. Women live longer than men, so they face more financial security problem than men. Women face than men. Another issue is in a lot of countries, women have a lower retirement age, and that puts them. That means they have more excess work capacity as they retire early, and then they accumulate less pension rights, so which will put them at a lower pension income at older age. So there's some public policy issues that could address these issues. One is whether women can inherit their husband's social security. In China, for example, women cannot. So poverty for women, female poverty at old age is higher than men. Then there's also education. The Chinese women have much worse health than men, and one big explanatory factor is education. So with improved education, then that gap is expected to narrow.
Thank you. A question for Professor Borsch-Supan. Why do you think people in Europe and elsewhere are so pessimistic about aging and do not want to adapt to it?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. I think that this is characterized by three catchwords. One is entitlement, another one is populism, and the third one is ignorance. So you see, I start fairly pessimistic. So entitlement, and actually, Chris, you called it identity, but I mean in some sense the same thing. The pay-as-you-go systems, which are omnipresent in all across the world, they sort of instill the idea that I want the same as my parents got, because I pay in for my kids, so I want the same from. And that creates a very backwards point of view and screws up thinking in public policy and sort of builds in an automatism against adaptation to any kind of change, particularly demographic transition. So that's one explanation. And that's important because it's sort of the first stage. The second stage is populism. Now, if you as a politician do something the voters don't like, well, there's your head gone. And so populism, which is a very strong trend, enforces then this backwards thinking. And it anyway does, but it makes it even stronger because of the first point. And the third point is strictly ignorance. And some of you already pointed out that we use words which just do not really fit to the developments. Age tsunami, baby boomers bulge. Germans like alliterations, and these very negative connotations which go with aging rather than the positive one. So there's also ageism behind these kind of perceptions. But I'm also shocked by maybe Congress men and women are better educated, but even if I talk to members of the parliament in Germany, it's amazing how little they know about demographic transition, aging, longevity, and these kind of things. Now, you cannot expect that people in the among the voters are well educated. Some of them should be, but at least the lawmakers should, and they are not. Very frustrating. So this is why this combination of three catchwords: entitlement, populism, and ignorance, and that's what we have to fight about to change that.
I agree completely. I see a hand up from Cheng Wan from CPAR. Can you unmute your video? There. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, can you see me? Can you hear my voice?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you very much for the very interesting discussion and presentation. So I have one question for the speakers and the discussants in session one. So I see a lot of discussion is around the sustainability of the pension of the retirement system. And some of the present speakers mentioned about, for example, biological age rather than chronic age. I think it's a very interesting thing. So can we think something? Can we say something about the equality? So based on that, for example, there are young people and the older people. So equality from the different generation, and also for people with different health status. So people have better health and people have worse health. And if we based on the biological thing to design the pension system and the retirement decisions, how design a system and to choose to be suitable for such kind of this kind of issue? Yeah, that's my question.
Thank you. Who would like to make an effort to respond?
So, Olivia, maybe I will just say a few words in response to Chen's question. Chen, thank you for the question. Yes, so you are right that even though in the population on average, right, the age-specific mortality rates has been declining over time, there is still within every cohort, there is still a lot of heterogeneity in terms of mortality rates. It's even different by education, by occupation. So there are a lot of things that detail to be worked out in terms of how to link the retirement age to biological age rather than chronological age to ensure fairness or equity. To basically mitigate some of the potential redistributional impact of such a reform. And so I would say maybe there will be need to a lot of data collection to make sure that we have good life tables, not just for the overall population, but by occupation and so on. So I think that a lot of firms are thinking about establishing the second pillar of the pension system, the enterprise pension system, in search of such occupation specific life tables. And I think there's a big data availability issue for now. But I think these are the data infrastructure need to be improved as well to implement such a type of transition to a biological age kind of linked retirement system.
Thank you.
Chrisaritas, first Chris and then Axel.
Thank you very much. Well, I saw that Linda has joined us, so I'm going to pose the question that I raised in my discussion of your paper, your talk, which I enjoyed thoroughly actually listening to you. I always learn something from your talks. Last time I learned about the portfolio of skills that workers should have, and I mentioned it a few times in my talks. This time I learned about identity and how to change our identity over the life cycle. But I had a problem, and I raised it, the others have heard it because he was in my discussion. How do you change identity? I think it's a very difficult thing to do, especially as people get older. So in fact, I said if I was ever going to go back to my work of markets with friction, I would have mentioned identity as a friction, as technology changes rapidly, and bring it in and discuss it. I don't know if I could model it, but anyway. I wonder if you had any more thoughts, since you've written those great books with my former student, Andrew Scott. I had to throw this in. I wonder if you had any thoughts about how you actually go about changing the identity of older people so that they change roles and have this multi-stage life cycle.
Well, thank you.
Antimodigliani life cycle, as I called it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. And I do apologize for having to video that. I was doing something that I couldn't get out of until a few moments ago. So I apologize for that. But I was able to hear some of the conversations. I wanted to say a couple of things, and then I'm going to talk about Chris's point on identity. The first thing to say is I study work, really. I'm very fortunate to be working with Andrew Scott, who studies the economics, but I study work. And what's become really clear is that ageism is rife in many organizations. It's extremely difficult to get a job in an organization if you're over the age of 50. And we also know that the impact of the pandemic has made that even worse in many countries around the world. People who over the age of 60 have just simply not come back to work. So the first point I want to say is that if we're going to make any change at all, we have to change the attitude that organizations have to the people who are over 55. That's the first thing. The second thing is we have to help people have personal agency. So Chris, in response to your question, what do we do? Well, we don't do anything, but they do a lot. And what we know that people are capable of transforming their identity. And they do it in three ways. First of all, they begin to use a different narrative. And part of the reasons though I'm not an age specialist, as some of you know, I'm a work specialist, but part of the reason I've written about age and demography is that I wanted to change the narrative about how people over the age of 60, which I certainly am, talk about themselves. So they change the narrative. The second thing they do is they change their networks. It's very difficult for you to change your identity if you spend all your time with people just like you. So the other thing to encourage is for people to spend time with people of different age groups. And one of the challenges, by the way, on that is many of our institutions, like the way that we teach people, the way that we put people together into groups, the way we sell to people, the way that we think about how they amuse themselves, we have pushed towards that being much more homogenous in terms of age. I see this at London Business School. It's very difficult to get to LBS over the age of 40 or 50, except in a very specific way. So we have to encourage people to network with people who are different from them. And by doing that, they get a sense of what the alternative identity can be, what I, as a psychologist, would call possible self. And then thirdly, they need to find ways of actually activating these new potential identities. And they do that primarily through action. So doing different things. For example, we know that there are more entrepreneurs now over the age of 50. The way that you become an entrepreneur over the age of 50 is that you start thinking about it, you start networking with other entrepreneurs, and then you start doing side gigs or projects that will help you to develop those skills. So we are, Chris, completely capable of identity shifts, but it is a transition that organizations, individuals have to actually, it's a question of personal agency.
He promised Axel would be next.
Yeah, but only brief, because this goes back to talking about biological age. Actually, Zoom is quite interesting in you look at these titles and then you determine the biological age of these people here. It's not that trivial. Anyway, most pension systems actually have a built-in biological age, retirement age, which is indirectly done by disability pensions. I think this is the road to go, to be much more flexible and to have sort of a pension system which is more flexible between 100% disability and 100% old age pension. And that can be made to adapt to biological age. So we're not that far from it, actually.
Oh, Yao Hui, very short, because we have one more speaker after you.
Yeah. So to follow up on that earlier question of biological age or chronological age, wouldn't it be natural if we have a DC system that people, and not a fixed retirement age, that people would choose their retirement timing by their own health? This is also to Olivia and Axel. I wonder what your response is to my assessment of the Chilean system and Singaporean system. Should the world start to promote the Singaporean system instead of the Chilean system?
Well, that's a topic for a much longer discussion, and we still have a couple of people with hands up, and I'm cognizant of the clock. But what I would say is Chile, Australia, Singapore, they all have national defined contribution systems with a mandated saving. I think it's just unfortunate that Chile let people take, over half of the people have no pension savings because of these withdrawals. But let me quickly give the floor to Li Wei, Wang, and what was your question, please?
Yeah, perhaps a brief question for Albert Park and Linda Grattan. So in this session, we mentioned a bit less about China, actually, for which it is actually undergone very dramatic change. You know, this regulation on many of the profitable sector are actually have this demographic issue behind. I think for Albert, you mentioned is doing a study on China's robotics situation. How do you compare the application of it in China compared to other countries? And we know, quickly to Linda, we know that China controlled this COVID situation relatively well, which means China is using less this remote work compared to Western countries. Do you see it going forward also provide some kind of help to China's kind of demographic situation, given that China's retirement age is very early, and especially for women, it's 50 or 55, even lower than men's? Thanks.
I think the answer will have to be a 1-minute answer. Albert, do you want to try to go
Sure.
there?
Yeah. So quickly on robots in China, China has subsidized robot development in many cities. And it reminds me of a colleague interviewed some workers at a factory that was automated, and the worker was like, why are they subsidizing the robots and not the people? And I think it gets to the point that Chris made is we have a choice. And one of the simple things is, for God's sake, at least let's not distort the factor prices against labor. Probably there's going to be a lot of automation in China anyway, because there's labor scarcity and wages are going up very quickly. So business will do that. But to add subsidies on that is accelerating something which may take you in a direction that you may not like in the end. So that's just the quick comment on that. One other comment I wanted to just make is that, we're talking about Chile, Singapore, more complicated pension systems that factor in health. I actually would like to make a plug for the universal pension program idea, the social pension program, which I think especially for developing and emerging market countries is much more compelling, because a lot of these countries have informal sectors, which are like India, 90% of people are informal. There's no way to design any of these systems that's going to get you coverage. And we also know from the research in China that even a small amount of pension coverage has enormous benefits for people's well-being. And so that's, I think, really a place to start. And also, last point about that is, we also know that in a lot of these rapidly developing countries, the elderly have very poor health and very low education, and can really benefit. And the system can definitely afford to be generous to these people.
I think I'm going to have to leave it at that, because we have the privilege of a few closing remarks from Ben Holstrom from MIT. So without further ado, would you like to share your screen?